Hello, biologists. Welcome back. We are now going to continue our discussion of animal diversity and take it into the vertebrates. Remember, the vertebrates are that small group of animals that fits within the chordates. We share a lot of characteristics in common with the two chordate invertebrate groups that we talked about. So, without further ado, here we go. Vertebrates are an incredibly cool group, partly because, well, we're vertebrates. But before we go on to the diversity of vertebrates, let's first recall the four chordate characteristics that make vertebrates very similar to the two invertebrate groups that we finished up with in the last lecture. These include, by the way, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Those are the vertebrates. And remember, these are cousins to those two invertebrate groups. The four chordate characteristics: dorsal hollow nerve cord, a notochord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a post-anal tail. So don't forget that. Um, Vertebrates have been around for a very long period of time. We do talk about them being kind of a more derived group, having evolved more recently, but that's not really all that true. Vertebrates have been around for 500 million years. And there are a couple of really important evolutionary trends that you see in the vertebrates. The first being the evolution of a jaw. Believe it or not, all those animals you think of with jaws, yeah, they're all vertebrates. Also, the evolution of lungs. This occurs in the vertebrates. And the first group of vertebrates that we're going to cover are the fishes. And fish can be divided into three main groups. We're going to go over each of these three main groups before we head into the things that you're probably more familiar with that live on land. The first group are the agnaths. And agnaths are jawless fishes. The name comes from and anytime you see a in front of a word, it means not having it or not possessing it. And gnath, or just nath if you have the G be silent, nath is the scientific word for jaws. So agnaths are jawless fish. Jawless fish used to be very, very abundant in the distant past. Today, there's only two surviving groups of agnath fish, of jawless fishes. That would be the lamprey and the hagfish. The second group of vertebrates are the chondrichthyes. Class chondrichthyes, chondra means cartilage, and ichthyes is the scientific word for fishes. So chondrichthyes are cartilaginous fishes. They include a lot of fish out there. Most especially the ones that you would know the most would be the sharks and the rays, but it includes a couple of other things, including ratfish down here. We're not going to talk about ratfish today, but you are familiar with sharks and rays. The third group falls into what we're going to call a superclass, osteichthyes. Osteichthyes. Oste means bone, and ichthyes again is fish. So osteichthyes are bony fishes. We will talk about two main groups within the osteichthyes. The first one are actually the ones down here, the actinopterygii. And these are all of your bony fishes. Bony fishes that, like your goldfish or whatever it was that you probably caught when you went fishing the last time. Um, and the second group here is this really funny group of bony fishes called the Sarcopterygii. And Sarcopterygii are lungfishes and a few other relatives of theirs, including the coelacanths, etc. So we're going to go ahead and now jump into the diversity of fishes. And when I say diversity, I mean it. Fishes are the most diverse group of vertebrates on the planet. Half of all vertebrates are fish. That's over half, actually. And the evolution of the invasion of land actually occurred first in the fishes. So at the end of our fish talk, we're going to actually discuss how fish evolved the ability to at least take advantage of land. And the first group, so let's talk about the agnaths first. We're only going to mention them with one animal here as an example, and that would be the hagfish. These are deep sea scavengers, but they possess a couple of interesting characteristics that make them or that help define this group. The first being that they have multiple gill slits, and I want you to think back to the cephalochordates that we discussed in the last lecture, at the end of the last lecture. They kind of had multiple gill slits on the side, and it looked sort of like this. In these hagfish, which I don't know, I think they're kind of beautiful looking. Maybe you disagree. but they have these multiple gill slits that run down the sides of their bodies, and they also have no true jaws, so they don't have an articulating lower jaw. They do have a mouth that looks kind of cool, like this, but that lower jaw area there does not articulate. It's just one big sucking organ with a bunch of teeth on it, and so they essentially suck the flesh right out of their prey after cutting it with these teeth. Kind of cool. Now, one other thing that you might notice that makes them a little different from other fishes is they don't have any fins. Think about your goldfish, think about even sharks and that sort of thing. No fins here, no fins at all. Now, that is going to kind of define hagfish and then a couple of other relatives of theirs that you might have heard of, including lamprey. Lamprey also are egg gnats, but we're not going to discuss them today. Um, However, the evolution of the jaw was probably the single biggest early development in the fishes. And really, the jaw, what you consider to be a jaw, this lower element here that can articulate up and down, is really an embryonic development that over evolutionary time emerged from these skeletal rods that helped make up the gill arches or the pharyngeal gills of the earliest chordate ancestors. And so the development of the jaw occurred early in the fish. It is what separates the egg gnats from all other fishes. The second group of fish are the cartilaginous fishes. Again, chondrichthyes. This is where the first jaws first appear, 430 million years ago. Now, the interesting thing about the cartilaginous fishes is that their entire skeleton is made of cartilage. There is no bone in sharks, rays, or skates. Um, and they also still retain this multiple gill opening scenario. So they do share that in common with egg gnats. Think about a shark. Sharks actually have multiple gill slits running down the sides of their body. And that's very similar to egg gnats. Now, they also possess what are known as dermal denticles. Dermal means skin, and denticles refers to like teeth. Well, they're not real teeth, but they resemble teeth. You can look at these two pictures here, they kind of resemble teeth. So we call them skin teeth or dermal denticles. Now, they do resemble scales, right? Fish have scales on the side. Bony fishes do, but not cartilaginous fish. Cartilaginous fish have these dermal denticles that are not true scales. They are derived in a completely different way. Um, and these do include the sharks and the rays. You're familiar with that. But skates is another type of flatty kind of cartilaginous fish, a flattish fish that looks very similar to rays. But the one that you're probably most familiar with, of course, is the shark. Sharks are all predators. They're all highly adapted for swimming, and they are indeed very diverse. Now, it's important to note here that while we have a deep admiration for sharks, and in fact many of us have a fear of sharks, the reality is that fear has led to a massive destruction of this group of organisms over the last few decades. And we're going to come back to sharks and shark preservation later. Just a very important point is that sharks of even 100 years ago compared to today, or even 50 years ago compared to today, they are only 10% of their former abundance right now. We've essentially almost wiped them out on the face of the planet. And it would be a really bad day if and when all sharks were eliminated from our oceans. They serve a very important purpose that most people don't appreciate. And we'll get to that in the ecology section and then also in the um, conservation section. Okay, but for now, we're going to leave it there and not talk about cartilaginous fish anymore. Instead, I want to move on to the bony fishes, Actinopterygii. And in the Actinopterygii, the bony fishes, these are by far the most diverse group of fishes. 96% of all fish that you see in the ocean or on land or in a pet store are bony fishes. They possess true bone. And another difference between these guys and sharks and the egg gnats is that these guys only have a single gill opening. Think about a goldfish, or even look at this picture here of this squirrelfish. Only one gill opening here. That one single opening, which is known, by the way, as an operculum, that's the opening right there, defines bony fishes. They also possess a swim bladder. And a swim bladder is a new development that is not present in sharks and certainly not present in aignaths. It helps them with buoyancy. We're going to discuss the importance of a swim bladder a little bit later, but another difference here is that unlike sharks, rays, and skates, which possess dermal denticles on their surface of their skin, these fish possess true scales, the scales that you're probably most familiar with if you've ever cleaned a fish. These scales are derived from bone. So, dermal denticles in sharks are not derived from bone. They are essentially outcroppings from the skin. So, they are skin derived. Scales here in bony fishes are not skin derived. They are actually grown in the same way that bone is grown. Even though they're kind of flexible, if you've ever felt a scale before, they are still derived from bones. Let's talk about sensory systems in fishes. Turns out there are 3 different systems that work in fishes and a 4th one that is only in sharks. The first one is sight. Yes, fish can see just like you and me. They also have rods and cones. The rods and cones are both proteins that are found in your eyes that allow you to form images, and in some cases, like in us, will allow you to see colors. This is not the primary system in fishes, though, and this is because even though you and I could stand on the building or the roof of a building and see for miles, that's not the case in water. Even the clearest visibility water is only going to have maybe 100 feet at the most, maybe 200 feet. That's about as far as you'd be able to see underwater. If you're off the coast of Southern California, good luck if you can see 20 feet underwater. So it wouldn't be in your best interest to have sight be your main feature. And instead, most of the energy put into sensing the environment around you, if you're a fish, goes into smell, olfaction. And this is very highly developed in fishes. In fact, we know this because 2/3 of a fish's brain just goes into processing smells. And this makes perfect sense because smells are really just chemicals dissolved into water. You know them, you know smells as chemicals dissolved into air, and your nose kind of picks that up. So they're doing the same thing in water. So they're smelling the water around them, and that is really the number one feature for a fish on how it interacts with the environment around it. Another one of the important developments in fishes is possessing a lateral line. A lateral line is this canal that actually runs down the length of the body of fishes. This is a bony fish. Here's a shark. They have them as well. And they are connected to a series of pits. And these pits connect up with a hollow chamber or a hollow tube that is just underneath the surface of the skin. And they are detecting pressure waves or water movement. So as water is vibrating or moving along the sides of them, they are imposing pressure through these pores and moving little tiny ciliary hairs inside of this tube. And from this, the fish can actually detect pressure waves around them. They can detect vibrations, which is really cool because they can actually feel the water around them. So this is number 3. These are the 3 main sensory systems found in all fishes. But that 4th variety that is only found in sharks are known as ampullae of Lorenzini. Ampullae of Lorenzini. These are specialized pits that you can see here on the face of this shark, right on the nose, but also just behind the eye here, and also all along the lower jaw. In fact, this image here shows you all of the various pitting across the head or face of this shark. Ampullae of Lorenzini, the word ampullae actually means pits or holes. Lorenzini is the biologist that discovered them. These are electromagnetic sensors, which is quite amazing. These guys are able to detect electromagnetic fields in the water around them. And really, if you think about it, that's not a sense that you or I have. So this is an extra sense that sharks have that you and I don't have. It's only present in sharks, rays, and skates, and also this funny group Chimera, which I mentioned in the first Chondrichthyes slide. They're able to detect currents down to 1/10 of a millivolt. That's really, really low. When you consider the amount of electromagnetic energy being given off by the watch that you are wearing on your wrist right now, the battery in your watch is probably running off of 3 volts. Well, that's 3,000 times more powerful. That watch battery is 3,000 times more powerful than the lowest magnetic fields that sharks can detect in the water. Yeah, quite amazing. And they use that quite effectively, too. Okay, now we're going to leave the fishes. We're going to, well, I guess not leave the fishes. We have to talk about a transitional group of fishes known as the lobe-finned fishes. These are the Sarcopterygiae that were mentioned in our first slide where we were introducing fishes. These fish have been around for quite a long time too. They are bony fishes, so they are related to your goldfish and that sort of thing. But there is a new evolutionary nuance that has occurred in this fish, which makes them very interesting when studying tetrapods, that is, those organisms that emerged up onto land. You see, if you look at a typical fish's forelimb, that is, if you look at their fins, they really just articulate at a joint. So it's just a single joint that kind of flaps back and forth that allows them to swim through the water. Well, in lobe-finned fish, there has been a second piece of bone that has actually emerged by just over evolutionary time. So instead of just articulating up here at the shoulder, they can actually articulate in the middle part of that appendage. And this allows them to ambulate or walk very similarly to that of terrestrial vertebrates. And these guys, these lobe-finned fish, are the direct ancestors of amphibians. It is in this group also that a true lung emerges. That's right, a lung first evolves in a fish. We're going to talk about lungs in amphibians and in reptiles and in other animals, but where we first see a lung develop is actually in fishes. Now you might ask, well, how did lungs just come about? Did they just emerge? Did they just appear? No. Remember I had mentioned that swim bladder in bony fishes? Well, the swim bladder is initially used for buoyancy control, and yet you can also do gas exchange with it. Any air that is in contact with a swim bladder inside of a fish is able to exchange those gases across that swim bladder lining. And that is really, for all intents and purposes, a lung. If it's doing gas exchange, it's a lung. The only difference here is that lobe-finned fish are able to inflate that lung more effectively than any other kind of bony fish. So this is actually quite amazing, and these lobe-finned fish are our direct relatives to amphibians. They are the direct ancestor that leads to amphibians. They possess, and down here we have an ancestral amphibian, and we're comparing its limbs to that of the lobe-finned Sarcopterygiae fishes. And again, it's because they have two sets of bones. Think about yourself. You have a bone between your shoulder and your elbow, and then you have another set of bones between your elbow and your wrist. Okay, that's not present in other bony fishes. Only in lobe-finned fish do they have that. So let me move on now, and let's take a look. Oh yeah, and so this is actually kind of funny. Great moments in evolution. This is a great Gary Larson cartoon where we have a bunch of fish that have hit a baseball out onto land. And it's kind of funny. We say great moments in evolution because here one of the fish has to get out of the water to go get that ball again. So this is Gary Larson's funny take on fish emerging onto land. So here is kind of the basic setting for how all fish are related. We've got our hagfish and our lamprey down here. These are our jawless fish. They are the first in the lineage. Then they give rise to the chondrichthyes, which are the cartilaginous fish. Up here we have our typical Actinopterygiae, which are our bony fishes. And within the bony fishes, we have this one here, Sarcopterygiae, which has that articulating forelimb and also development of lungs. And the animals that emerge from these Sarcopterygiae are the amphibians. And that's the group we're going to go into now, are the amphibians. You know amphibians from frogs and salamanders, but we're going to go into a little bit greater detail on that now. You see, amphibians were the first vertebrates to actively walk on land, and they are the direct descendants of fishes. And this is kind of that connection there. Again, this is another image which is similar to the one I showed just a couple slides ago. Here we have our lobe-finned fish, and here's this lobe-finned fish has that extra bone, what you would call the humerus bone. And here is an early amphibian with the same kind of arrangement here, just like that. One organism in particular here that I do want to bring to your attention is Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is kind of considered a transitional species. This animal here actually is a fish. Tiktaalik is an ancient lineage of fish that emerged from the lobe-finned fish that directly connects to amphibians. This guy here was actually discovered in 2006, so it's a very recent discovery. And they had gills and scales, just like a fish, but they had a neck which was very similar to that of an amphibian. If you looked at their bone structure, their neck is akin to that of an amphibian. They possessed a true shoulder, a forearm, and a wrist bone just like an amphibian. But again, they had gills and scales just like a fish. So this guy is transitional and eventually leads us to the amphibians. Now the amphibians are well adapted for land, at least partly so. They possess true legs so that they can walk on land. They have true lungs, and they can actually ventilate them by expanding them and contracting their lungs. They do it with muscles in their throat. And they also can do supplemental cutaneous respiration. So this actually helps because their lungs may not deliver all the oxygen that they need, so they're able to absorb some of that through their skin. Pretty amazing. They also possess a partially divided heart. And this helps in increasing the efficiency of circulation. It is nowhere near as efficient as what you will find in later organisms, but it is far better and far more efficient than what we see in fishes. Okay, now those are the advantages of being an amphibian over a fish. Now some of the limitations, if you're going to be a terrestrial animal living on land, here are the limitations. By only having a partially divided heart, it means that you're still going to be mixing your blood. The stuff that you oxygenate from breathing in and the stuff that has already gone through your body and has given up all of its oxygen, your deoxygenated blood, is allowed to mix in a heart that is not fully divided. So this is a shortcoming, is that you're always only going to get partial oxygenation of your blood. In addition to that, you still have soft eggs. So your reproduction has to still happen in water. And this is really kind of the number one limitation, is that you can't bring your reproduction truly up onto land. You have to lay your eggs in water so that they don't dry out. Also, your skin has to be somewhat moist because they don't have skin that can avoid desiccation. A frog or a toad will eventually dry out entirely unless it's able to remain in contact with water somehow, immerse themselves in water, or at least be in a hot, humid environment where their skin will not dry out normally. Let's move on to the next group now, the evolution of reptiles. These guys arose directly from amphibians, and they are far better adapted to life on land. Reptiles have tough, scaly skin, and I want to at least mention to you the protein that their skin cells are made out of, keratin, lots of keratin in their skin cells. And their skin, or I should say their skin cells are secreting lots of keratin and producing this thick hide-like structure. And this is really impervious to water. So it's a great solution for losing water to the air by having keratin lining your outer skin. They've also dealt with the reproduction issue by internalizing fertilization. So instead of laying eggs in the water and then having the male come over and have to fertilize those eggs in the water, fertilization is internalized, very similar to what it is in humans. In reptiles, they actually have an evertable penis that is able to deliver sperm directly to the eggs. This solves a lot of problems because now development can occur internally. Another development is that when you do lay your eggs have a coat around them that keeps them protected from desiccation. We know these as being amniotic eggs or being an amniote egg. And here's an egg right down here with all the various parts to the egg. Okay, water conservation is also a key issue here. When you are living in the water, you don't have to worry about where your water is going to come from. It's all around you. But when you're living up on land, you better be really efficient with your water. If you're just using it up and letting it go out of you, well, you're going to desiccate and die rather quickly. So in reptiles is where we see the first true water conserving kidneys evolving. You have water conserving kidneys as well. Now, these animals are also ectothermic. That is to say, they don't have the ability to control their own body temperature like you do. Whether you're awake or whether you're asleep, your body remains at the same temperature. Whereas if you're a reptile, during the daytime or nighttime, your temperature is going to be tied to whatever the outside temperature is, the ambient temperature. Okay, so let's come back to that egg issue and just compare what frog spawn looks like. Here's frog spawn over here, compared to turtle eggs. And turtles are reptiles. Turtle eggs are far better protected. They have that nice leathery coat around them, around the shell, which prevents water loss. So it's kind of nice. Okay, let's go ahead and switch gears now a little bit. We just got done talking about the reptiles, and we're going to now begin talking about birds and mammals. However, we need to make a little bit of a connection here. Reptiles and birds and mammals all possess one thing in common. We are all amniotes. And this word amniotes is a reference back to producing a shell or laying a shell. And in reptiles, this was a great solution that amphibians could not do, and that is create an egg that could withstand desiccation being out of the water. Well, eggs are also present in birds, and it turns out they're also present in some mammals, which will be further for discussion here. But the main parts of an egg are kind of universal, whether we're talking a mammal egg, a bird egg, or a reptile egg. All amniotic eggs possess four membranes. They possess a chorion, which is the outermost layer where gas exchange takes place. There's the amnion, which encases the embryo and in the fluid-filled cavity. Then there's the yolk sac, which provides a food source or a storage for food for the developing embryo. And then there's the allantois. And the allantois is responsible for dealing with waste excretion from the embryo. So all of that stuff is essentially housed within the egg and keeps that embryo going for as long as it takes for gestation to take place and for the embryo to eventually develop enough to hatch out. So this is present in all reptiles, birds, and in some mammals. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, I want to show you guys a couple of skulls right now because the reptile lineage split off and formed a whole bunch of clades of organisms, many of whom you still see today. And a lot of these skulls comparisons are done by looking at what's called a window or a temporal opening behind the eye, or what's known as the orbit. The orbit is where the eye socket is. Over here we have a skull type where there is no opening behind the orbit. It's just basically the orbit, and that's it. These skulls are known as anapsids, anapsid skulls. Anytime you see an A in front of a word, again, that means not having it. So anapsid refers to not possessing these temporal openings behind the orbit. This middle case here is called a synapsid skull. Synapsids have a single opening behind the orbit, and diapsids have two openings behind the orbit. These are all three reptile lineage skulls. We see this in all reptiles, all ancient reptiles from about 250 million years ago. But there's a caveat to this. You see, mammals actually emerged from the earliest reptiles. We possess a synapsid skull. If you look at the embryonic development of all mammals, they possess this single opening back here. And if you go back 250 million years ago, you will find reptiles that have that identical construct in their skulls. In this case over here, anapsids are one whole lineage of reptiles which we still see today, the turtles. So turtles possess this. And again, anapsid is 0, synapsid is 1, and diapsid is 2 as far as the temporal openings behind the orbit. Okay, so here's your turtle lineage, here's your mammal lineage, and all modern reptiles, including lizards, snakes, and birds, and then also dinosaurs, it turns out, these guys possess the diapsid skulls, which have 2 openings behind the orbit. So this is how, when we see a fossil in the ground and we dig it up and we look at its skull, we can tell whether it is the skull of an early reptile or the skull of an early mammal or the skull of an early turtle. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of reptiles. Reptiles have been around for a very long time, since at least the Triassic period, which goes back at least 248 million years. This is when the diapsid lineage begins. Again, all modern reptiles are diapsids. Let me go back for a second. They are this variety over here. But keep in mind that these 2 varieties have also been around just as long. The therapsids, which is one whole group of reptiles that existed in the past, that actually gave rise to us. So the therapsids would be like the mammal lineage that came from the reptiles. They were eventually replaced in abundance by diapsids about 230 million years ago. The diapsids that we're talking about that took over eventually became the dinosaurs. So 230 million years ago, dinosaurs are really doing well on this planet, and that lineage, which ultimately led to the mammals, begins to get de-emphasized. So the archosaurs, the first kind of bipedal land vertebrates, are emerging right about this time, including a whole bunch of reptile lineages, the crocodiles, the pterosaurs, including pterodactyls and other flying reptiles, also the dinosaurs. By the way, the pterosaurs, the pterodactyls, they are not dinosaurs. They were a cousin group to them. And then eventually the birds. And we're going to make a connection here between the birds and the dinosaurs real soon. The dinosaurs essentially dominated this planet for over 150 million years. They eventually went extinct about 65 million years ago, or at least most of them did. Again, we're going to come back to that. And one whole lineage of dinosaurs, though, was not wiped out by this impending doom. It turns out it was a combination of climate issues that destroyed the dinosaurs, along with a meteor strike on the planet. Essentially, the climate made a very bad situation for the dinosaurs. And then the meteor strike, it was essentially the straw that broke the camel's back and wiped out the vast majority of dinosaurs with only one lineage remaining. Can you guys guess what that lineage is? If you guessed birds, then you are right. Turns out birds are the direct descendants of the dinosaurs. They are still alive today. They are essentially living dinosaurs. So go and hug a bird and thank him for being a dinosaur. Okay, let's go ahead and revisit some of these important modern developments that we see in reptiles. We mentioned the internal fertilization thing already. You might ask yourself, well, when does the sperm fertilize the egg if they're laying an egg, right? Well, we're referring to the actual gamete that is in the female. The sperm comes in and actually fertilizes it, producing a zygote before the membranes get placed around it and that hard leathery shell. And this is ultimately what the reptile will lay into her nest. But the fertilization act happens before the shell is actually formed. They also have greatly improved circulation, far better than what you see in amphibians. Many of them still have a single ventricle here, so there is still going to be some blood mixing going on here. It's not incredibly efficient. However, some reptiles actually do have 4 chambered hearts, just like a human. So these reptiles have really good circulation. And one good example of that is the crocodile, and also, it turns out, birds too. And you know, we call birds something separate. We give them a different name. But the reality is they are still dinosaurs. They are simply highly specialized reptiles. Well, coming back to this circulation issue, oxygen is delivered far more efficiently with the reptile circulation plan. Certainly when there's a four-chambered heart, but even when it's still only three-chambered heart, it's still much better than what you have in the amphibians. The septum in the heart, that is this dividing chamber here, or this dividing line, actually creates a partial wall, which this is actually what helps in oxygenating the blood. It's even better when it extends all the way down, creating a four-chambered heart. And four-chambered hearts are seen in crocodiles, in birds, and in mammals. Now, let's talk about the four living reptile orders, shall we? Dinosaurs, again, are no longer with us except for one lineage, the birds. We should include them here as a living reptile order, but for history's sake, we're going to treat them separately. We're going to deal with them separately. So other than birds, we have the order Crocodilia, all the crocodiles, Chelonia, and Chelonia are the turtles and tortoises. This real strange group here called the Rhynchocephalia, or Tuatara, there's only two species of these things left on the planet. You might look at them and go, well, they look like lizards to me. Well, they're not exactly lizards. They actually possess a third eye that is underneath a series of scales on the top of their head. So they're actually looking skyward through a series of scales with a third eye. These are very ancient reptiles. There's only two species still remaining, and you need to go to essentially the islands off of New Zealand to see these guys. And then we have the most modern of all the reptile groups, Squamata. These make up the lizards and the snakes. So what about this connection with birds? Because clearly birds are the descendants of dinosaurs. There is a huge amount of evidence for this. Lots and lots of fossil evidence, and actually we even have some tentative protein sequence evidence to suggest the relationship between birds and dinosaurs. This slide here illustrates the lines of descent that eventually lead to modern birds. They are the direct descendants of dinosaurs. In that lineage, the one that you probably would recognize from the movies would be this guy here, Velociraptors, from the movie Jurassic Park. But this guy being in that lineage that ultimately leads to birds was a fierce predator. It was not a very large dinosaur, but it certainly was a fierce predator. And the other bird that is well known in this lineage is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a direct descendant of the dinosaurs and the ancestor that leads to modern birds. Archaeopteryx actually had a tail like a reptile. It also had teeth, just like a reptile, but it had feathers and was able to glide, probably not fly in the same way that modern birds can, but they could certainly glide through the sky. Okay, so let's come to the modern birds. Even though the modern birds essentially are highly specialized reptiles, we are going to still treat them as their own separate group for now. They are the most diverse group of vertebrates on the planet. They far outnumber all reptiles, they outnumber all amphibians, and they even outnumber all mammals. The success here is really owing to the fact that they have feathers. Feathers probably evolved not necessarily for the purpose of flight initially, certainly that's how birds use them today, but it probably evolved as a way to control temperature. Okay, let's go through the class Aves. Aves is the scientific name for birds, class Aves. The defining features here would be possessing feathers. Hey, guess what feathers are made out of? They're actually made out of keratin, just like the scales in reptiles. So really, feathers are just highly modified scales made of the same material, keratin. They also possess that amniotic egg. They are indeed specialized for flight, but they do differ from other reptiles in that they are endothermic. They actually have the ability to maintain their own body temperature, kind of like in humans. Now, the modern view here, they retain lots and lots of reptilian traits, like, for example, having that amniotic egg. And, by the way, if you ever look at a chicken, you see all the feathers on the chicken, but look at its feet. The feet or the lower legs of a chicken still have scales. And also they might lack teeth, but they do lack a long tail like reptiles. But in the ancestral view, they still did. Very, very ancient birds still did possess teeth and had the remnants of tails. Two major distinguishing characteristics, though: possessing feathers, which are essentially modified scales of keratin. Again, we're just restating this here. And those feathers have an added benefit now. Remember, they're initially used for conserving heat, but once you have feathers, now you actually have the means to produce lift. So flight actually is a secondary adaptation in birds. Flying skeleton is also a new emergence that we see in birds that is different from other reptiles, is their bones are actually very thin and very hollow. This means that they are much lighter, and they are also fused in many places. Instead of having articulations like you or I might have in our arms or our legs, their bones in many places are fused, and they essentially create big flat areas for anchorage for muscles, and this really helps them in flight. Now, the earliest birds, as I had mentioned, Archaeopteryx is really regarded as the earliest bird. It still had a skull with teeth in it, a long reptilian tail, but it possessed feathers on its wings and also on its tail. But what's really interesting is even though they had wings that could glide or at least fly short distances, the forelimbs of those wings still were nearly identical to that of the dinosaurs. Now, the evolution of feathers, again, I just want to reiterate this again. It probably evolved for insulation initially, but it at least set the basis for flight. And once flight took off, well, so to speak, it was all downhill from there. Birds began to dominate the planet. And even today, again, they are the most numerous of all of the vertebrates. The first bird to not have teeth and to actually have a beak without teeth was this one right here, and it's Confuciusornis is how you pronounce that. Confuciusornis is the genus of this bird. Modern birds have 28 orders of birds. That's a lot of orders of birds. The most ancient of all of the birds are in fact flightless. They can't fly. Think about ostriches. That's a good example. The next most ancient birds would be the ducks, geese, and the waterfowl. But the most abundant bird group are the Passeriformes, which really comprise 60% of all of the species that we see on the planet today. Now, I want to come back to that adaptation for flight. If you are going to flight is very expensive. It takes a lot of energy to fly, so you better have really efficient respiration. And in fact, birds do. Their lungs work very differently from that of humans or any other mammal for that case. Uh, Air actually passes in a single direction through their lungs. So unlike yours, where the air goes in and then it has to go out, the air in bird lungs actually passes in a single direction, which actually increases the efficiency of gas exchange. As we mentioned before, like the crocodiles and the mammals, they also have a four-chambered heart, which helps with circulation, certainly. And their heart also beats extremely rapidly, which means that their blood is fully oxygenated, even more so than your blood, when it gets delivered to the cells. Being endothermic is also very important. Having the ability to retain your own body temperature and keep it maintained at a high temperature allows your body to work efficiently and keeps you essentially energetic enough to be able to fly. Of course, this is extremely, extremely expensive. You have to eat lots and lots of food to be able to maintain that high metabolism. Okay, so this ends our discussion of birds. We're now going to end the lecture here and pick it up with a continuation lecture next on the mammals. So I will see you all in cyberspace.